Are people let in?
Yeah, numbers going up.
Okay. Just give it a minute or two.
Yeah.
Oh, now I see the numbers. Okay, yeah, I'll give it a few minutes for people to join. I know their numbers are steadily increasing. For Friday afternoon after lunch, very impressive.
Well done. That's a lot of
Yeah.
participation.
That's right. Get a steady 100, I think, and get going that time.
Okay.
Okay, I'll just start with a welcome. Just want to welcome everyone to this pretty incredible collaboration between the California Planning Roundtable and APA California on this disaster recovery. We'll be going through wildfire, I think, recovery and assistance and bringing together a wealth of knowledge and resources to address this critical issue. I want to just start by saying thank you so much to Miguel and the rest of the team that have just mobilized very, very quickly. Sadly, in California, we've have lots of examples, which you'll hear about today. But I think, the aim is to explore, as many strategies and lessons learned to support the recovery and provide assistance in the wake of, this and other natural disasters. I think by melding our resources and expertise, we can develop effective solutions to, continue to, help hopefully provide a more sustainable, future for our communities. So we look forward to not just today, but ongoing active participation and valuable insights. I'm sure, Miguel, you'll share your the page where you're having people share, additional resources and comments. So thank you for joining us, and let's make this a productive and inspiring session. Turn it over to Miguel.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Miguel Ángel Vázquez. I am the immediate past president of the California Planning Roundtable. And as some of you who are in the planning space, you may know that the California Planning Roundtable is an affiliate of APA California. And in this instance, the California Roundtable is engaged in assisting the chapter in response to one of the biggest calamities that we could remember when it comes to wildfires in Southern California. Just to get us started, I wanted to share this screenshot that I took earlier on today from Cal Fire. And as you can see, we still have the fires burning. And, I don't need to tell you what is going on out there because everyone knows that this is devastating, not only for the communities that are experiencing these calamities, but also communities that have gone through these type of situations. And this is not the end. Every community is vulnerable to this type of environmental hazard. And we, the planners, have a significant role in addressing. For me, when I heard about the fires, I was concerned, but at some point my concern grew to desperation. I am not in LA, I'm in Riverside. And I felt almost, there were many feelings going through my mind, and I wanted to help in some sort of way. So I done a few things, but the one thing that I wanted to do was to exercise some of the competencies that I've gained as a planner. And as a result of that, some of you may have seen an announcement that I put on LinkedIn, a call to action, asking for anyone to contribute with their expertise to assist the planners who are dealing with the fires and in assisting with generating ideas to be able to be better responders as our communities continue to face these kinds of challenges. As a result of that call to action, which actually began through a conversation with our current president, Bernadette Austin, with the idea of the planner as a first respondent. And we started discussing what that looks like. And in this case, what you see is an expression of that. Soon after that, the California Roundtable was, through Bernadette, through our board of directors, was open to creating a working group to work with APA California. And you can see the names of the people who are participating in this group. Through our collective effort, we organized very quickly this webinar, and we're planning to do a series of these spaces to bring people who have something important to share as our communities rebuild and recover. And with that, I'd like to just share that APA California now has a web page dedicated to any information related to the work of this working group, including the webinars. We are going to be posting the recordings there. And we're also in the process of building a clearinghouse of resources for anyone who may be engaged in rebuilding and recovery. And with that, I'd like to then turn it over to our facilitator for today, Mark Roberts, who is a retired city manager from the city of Livermore, and he also serves as the California Planning Roundtable treasurer. With that, Mark.
Miguel, thank you very much for the introduction. What we hope to accomplish today is the first of a series of discussions that will help all of you who are in the center of this sort of think about all the things that you'll need to be thinking about to get from here to there. Literally, the fires are not out yet, and many of you in your emergency operations modes now, which simply means that you have a 70-hour week added on to your normal 60-hour week. And so one of the things that we wanted to do, because when you're in the middle of it, it's almost impossible to think about the things of what do I need to be thinking about that 1 year out, 3 years out, and 5 years out, I'm going to be really happy that I spent a little bit of time and effort on during these weeks, because it's not fair. The things will hit you way too fast from way too many angles. You'll be in the center of a lot of unhappiness, sometimes your own, because you're affected by the disaster just as all of the people you are serving are impacted. And so we want to help create a resource that can help you all get through that. And so the first of our discussions, we're going to start off today with Jeffrey Lambert. Thematically, what we're going to do is we're going to keep these sessions relatively short, hopefully just under an hour, because we just don't expect you all to have the kind of time to spend more than that. We're going to record these, so if you or your colleagues did not get a chance to tune in, you'll be able to go back and listen to them or see them, or listen and see the parts that you thought were really useful. Pull those back up when the time comes, because we might peak an item for you, but it's not quite time in your jurisdiction. So great, come on back. We also want to be a place where references and other materials, you don't have to go searching for them because they're here. And we also want to use your collective wisdom for those of you even who are in the middle of it. If you have a great resource, share it with the rest of your colleagues in APA, because some of the bigger jurisdictions, some corners of jurisdictions will have a few more resources to throw at this. So by sharing with the collective here, we can help those folks who are either understaffed, don't have enough time, or sort of would just like to have a few more options in front of them before they have to start making all of these decisions. Today's conversation, we're going to start off with Jeff Lambert. Jeff serves as the Chief Executive Officer for the Housing Authority for Ventura. The Housing Authority owns and manages more than 1,000 affordable units and 2,000 housing vouchers. Most recently, Jeff serves as the Chief Operating Officer of the Ventura County Community Foundation. Jeff previously served as the Community Development Director for the City of Oxnard and the City of Ventura. In these roles, he led the city's efforts to recover and rebuild from the Thomas Fire, which caused a loss of more than 500 homes and 2 apartment buildings in the city in 2017. And we used to think of that as an enormously large and incredibly unique urban fire. And it is very sad today that is a typical urban fire, and now someday may even be thought of as a relatively small urban fire. Jeffrey has a proven track record as a public servant through his career. He's recognized as AICP. And with that, Jeffrey, I'm going to turn it over to you to start a conversation. Then we'll do a little Q&A from me, and then we'll take some questions from folks out here in the webinar. So with that, Jeff, why don't you kick it off?
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. And thanks for Miguel for putting this together, and for APA and the roundtable putting this together as well. So I have to take myself back to December 4th, 2017. And that's when the Thomas Fire hit the city of Ventura. And as Mark mentioned, we lost over 500 homes, 524 to be exact, and 2 apartment buildings, one smack in the middle of town and one a little bit on the edge, but both really scary experiences. And I remember the fire chief and I tell this a lot, that he was the rock star fighting the fire for that week or two that the fire was really raging. And then he was done, and it was my job to recover. And I think arguably I had, to some degree, a harder job, because the recovery was a lot less certain than the efforts to fight a fire, as hard as that was. We were lucky we didn't lose any lives in the fire. We didn't find any bodies in the homes that were burned, but it was still a big disaster for a city the size of a little over 100,000 of Ventura. I like to remind people that what you have to always remember, that these are very emotional times. These folks that have lost everything in their lives, it's really hard for them to even figure out how to get up in the morning to come, let alone come to City Hall and figure out how to get a building permit. So I remind people, you have to remember how emotional this process is from the very beginning. And we did things that were, I think, really helpful to those emotional families. One, we gave them sort of protective gear to go sift through their properties, because as we're hearing now in Los Angeles, there's so many toxics in our home, and when they burn, whether it's plastics or refrigerators, it's dangerous to be looking for mother's engagement ring or something like that. But we know people want to, so how do we give them a chance to do that safely? Simple thing, but really important. For us, one of the things we did is we actually printed out, I know it's old school, but we printed out every city record we had on every property, building permits or any history we had on any parcel, put it in an envelope and handed it to those homeowners. Sometimes it was all they had left of their home, but it was really powerful and really had an impact on them, that they had something to start with. And it might be a building permit that has a record of how big their home was. It probably didn't have permits, because most of the homes were built in the 80s. I mean, it didn't have site plans, but it had permits and basic information, which I think was really important and helpful. What we're not insurance experts, but trying to remind homeowners to not go, pull up to that insurance van at the Lowe's parking lot and take the first check they offer you. Really be careful about what your insurance covers and doesn't cover, and take the time to understand that before you take that check, because it's really tempting. But often that check is not enough for you to rebuild. And for us, we started, so the fire was in early December. By mid-January, we had a rebuild strategy to the city council. It wasn't a codified strategy. It was just like, what's our approach to the rebuild? And I think one of the things that was really important for us is the council sort of approved sort of a rebuild statement. Sort of what's the parameters by which we're going to develop a rebuild strategy, because that helped us do something that was in line with what they wanted their constituents to have. And that strategy guided a lot of the process going forward. So that was really helpful to have them really engaged in the policy direction that we went. We also made it really clear that we made a decision immediately that rebuild was happening. We weren't going to have a debate about what neighborhoods were going to get rebuilt and which ones not. So homeowners knew immediately that we're going to let them rebuild. and that we were going to let them to rebuild what they had, and in our case, plus 10%. So that means they had the ability to maybe build their house differently than it was before, or reconfigure it. And that flexibility was really critical to those homeowners that knew that they had they had a path forward that was going to be helpful for them. And we went from yes, Mark.
Just to ask a question here.
Yeah.
How did you come up with 10%? That sounds like, it would have normally taken about 4 weeks of study and 3 consultants. I mean, that sounds like a very precise number. It was what they had plus 10% because that came from.
We actually brought a series of architects and engineers in to help us guide what made sense, and their experience, some of which had done homes in the hills. We lost most of the homes in the hills. And that guided us, and it was 10% height, 10% footprint, and 10% square footage. So it was a mixture of all those things. And frankly, it was a guesstimate, but we knew some level of flexibility was important, because not one person built their house back the way it was. Of the 500 homes, I can guarantee nothing looks like it did before. Everything came back differently. So I think it was whether it was scientifically determined or not, Mark, it really helped homeowners know that we were giving them something. They were going to get something more out of this disaster than they had before. And that actually helped them feel a little bit better about what they were about to go through. And it really made a difference. And it was ground truth with some experts in the field that helped us figure that out. And I know that's consistent with a lot of the Coastal Commission requirements as well. So there was some basis for it, but it really came down to giving homeowners some level of hope that they're going to get a better home than they had before.
And that's a fantastic thing to keep in mind, is because there'll be pressure on us to deal with I want to do something totally different, and others that will want to say, hey, it has to be exactly the same. And thinking through that and what kind of decision making you want to do, and being able to bring in some folks to help you make that sort of decision is a fantastic learned lesson. Thanks for that, Jeff.
Yeah, it was really helpful, I think. And just so clear, so fire in December 2017. By September of 2018, we had done 200 zone clearances, 100 homes were in plan check, and about 20 homes were under construction. And for us, one of the keys was to have a sort of a rock star homeowner that was rebuilding. We had a finished remodeling their home. They had very fresh building permits under the current building code. He was a general contractor before retirement. They moved like that they had a permit issued within weeks. And our goal was to make sure they got back in their home within 12 months, and they were able to finish construction and move in within 12 months. That was good for them, but it gave a whole bunch of hope to other homeowners that they could see the light at the end of the tunnel. And they became incredible advocates for their neighbors and doing stories about their experience. I remember that and one of the things that I would recommend too is allowing people to live on vacant properties that have been destroyed in RVs. This family in particular asked their neighbor, who wasn't ready to build yet, they put an RV on the next door property. They lived next door in an RV and were on site every day watching the rebuild. And the wife was even making cookies in her RV oven to bring over to the construction workers. And so that kind of stuff. But that became a political thing for us to make sure people could live in those properties while in an RV while they were going through the permit process, so they could stay on site, kind of keep track of their site. And that was something the council felt really strongly about. Our process was pretty straightforward. To come in with a concept plan, get a zoning clearance that, yes, you met the standard that we put in place with the 10% flexibility, and then get into building plan check. And then before a permit was issued, the zoning clearance was verified that the ultimate building plan matched the clearance. That was really valuable to everybody to have that clear process. We did something unique, which honestly, not every place can do. In addition to that 10% flexibility, we also had a modification process that nobody took advantage of, because that required noticing neighbors and sort of this little mini hearing process. Then we added a sort of whatever the community development director thinks is okay based on the council's statement of rebuild. And so I ended up having to approve about 30 units, 30 homes under my discretion, that it met the intent of the rebuild ordinance. And that was a lot of flexibility, a lot of pressure to do it right. But I'm proud to say I think only one of those properties had any kind of controversy, because those decisions were made to really reflect the council's goal of encouraging rebuilding, but also encouraging neighborhood cohesion. And I think that was really critical to the process as well. One of the things that planners don't know, go ahead, Mark.
Do you think that Did the council / planning commission delegate authority to staff that wouldn't have normally been there within side parameters?
Oh, yeah,
And do you
absolutely.
have any helpful hints about that?
I think because the council felt the pressure to move things on, and like any planning department, we don't always move as fast as people want to. And they understood in order to get their homeowners back into their homes, I had to sort of break all the rules. I don't think they would have given me that authority in any other circumstance. And the reality was, we had to keep in contact with the council on a regular basis and how it was going and what our experience was. So they felt that authority they gave me in particular was actually worth it, and it was actually turning into results. So tracking how many permits were being issued and seeing progress was really critical to keeping the council comfortable that what we did made sense. There were cases where I approved a 2-story rebuild on a previous 1-story house. Because there was no view impacts and there was no impacts to neighbors, and it worked out pretty well. And that homeowner decided they wanted more out of their house than they had before. But I think that communication with the politicians was really critical in this process. And we had people that didn't love the process because it was never perfect, but they understood that it was actually working for the vast majority of folks there. One of the things that I don't think as planners we would understand and pay attention to is this whole issue of debris removal. And I think that was one of the biggest aha moments for me. And we followed the Santa Rosa fire just a month earlier. And so we had a lot of lessons learned on debris removal. Their process of getting homeowners to allow the government to remove their debris was hard, but they learned so much coming down to Ventura, it was much easier for us. And so number one, you have to make sure that the toxics are removed first. So that's the first step in debris removal. Second is getting really the bulk of the debris removed, and having a third party do it and have a homeowner trust that their site's going to be taken care of by a government agency. Took some time to work through. Trust us, we're going to make it happen. We had committed to a very tight timeline of block by block. This was going to happen, and it would happen faster if everybody signed up and allowed us to do that. And we exceeded the timelines across the whole burn zone. And so we built some credibility and trust pretty quickly. What the homeowners needed to understand, if they did it, we would then have to we'd have to re-inspect to certify that it was done right. If the state did it, they would certify it by the end that the site was ready to go for rebuild. And I think that was one of the things, the factors that got homeowners to agree. The only thing the homeowners had to do was often their insurance policy had a debris removal line, a certain amount of money for that. They had to sort of give up that piece of their insurance to pay towards that. But the cost of debris removal was 3 or 4 times what they had coverage for. So it served their interest to do that. And I think that was really important. The second part of removal that was hard is you imagine you're a homeowner, you show back at your site and your foundation's there. And you think, oh, good, I can just build on the foundation. But they don't understand that 25 or 30-year-old foundation doesn't meet current building codes, and it was so compromised by the heat of the fire, it also had to be removed. And we had several debates with homeowners about why that thing that looked like it was ready to go had to be removed, and that was a challenge. But we got there in the end, and it had a lot of cooperation from those homeowners to do just that.
So Jeff, what happened in cases where you didn't have great plans? Did you have to sort of trust anybody off of an aerial photo to get sort of a rough takeoff on the square footage of their home or the layout, or something that was less precise and governmental, sanctioned?
We were lucky that we had just flown LiDAR the year before. So we had satellite LiDAR images of all the property that was burned in the fire, which was a pretty precise envelope of what was there before. And we got a release from homeowners to provide that to their architects, and the architects were able to use that to compare what was there before based on LiDAR and what they were proposing, and we could see the comparison. So in most cases, these homes were built in the 80s, and the building records didn't have full plans. They just had sort of a building sketch. So the LiDAR was a lifesaver for most homeowners because we had pretty precise descriptions of what was there before. And that made a huge difference to the process. Yeah.
Oh, but one of the things obviously is, depending on what your local jurisdiction has, getting some clear policy guidance from, the top about what references we're going to use and what flexibility staff has up front is way more fun than battling it out property by property by property by property.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that was real important for us to be able to have that set in state in stone at the beginning, and the council was really engaged and supportive of what we presented. I would say on sort of another sort of turn, I said at the beginning, this is an emotional process. What I tell people all the time is if you're assigning staff, because we of course created a separate permit process for fire victims who were rebuilding, so they didn't have to get in line with everybody else. Separate office, several dedicated staff just for them, so they built relationships, and that was all great. But if you had one person spending the day meeting after meeting with homeowners that lost everything and came in just shell shocked, that person couldn't last the day. And so we learned pretty quickly we had to rotate staff on a pretty regular basis, because just the sheer emotion of the staff's experience, not having lost everything, but they're dealing with folks who are in a really difficult state, was really important that we took care about our staff team, that they had the ability to take breaks and do other assignments, so that wasn't their all-time job. And some insisted on doing it all day because they felt so impassioned by their residents, but it really was difficult for staff to understand how hard that was, and we had to pay attention to their well-being. They were going to be better serving our residents if they had better health care and mental health during the day. So that was important. Just a few helpful hints to kind of wrap it up. One is, think about temporary power, temporary water. That's going to have to happen pretty quickly, so people have the ability to start construction. So thinking about those things. I mentioned earlier the RV. We had the first policy the council adopted was allowing people to live on RVs before we even did the rebuild policy, because that was clearly something they were hearing about. We had a homeowners association in part of the burn area that had a policy against RVs. We sort of had to negotiate with them to allow an exception to that policy, which they did. We allowed people to do temporary storage on sites while they were under construction or while they were going through the permit process, so they could actually use the site in some way. I mentioned that the Rockstar homeowner that got back in within 12 months, that was a really huge sort of a boost for many of our homeowners. We did a ribbon cutting when they moved into their home, which was really valuable to them. We tried to celebrate early successes. One of the things our communications team did, wasn't my idea, but we did yard signs that said, "I got my permit." And so when we issued a permit, they got a yard sign and they could stick it in their yard that people driving up the street knew they were making progress. And we did that after issuing the first maybe 20 permits, because we hadn't thought about it. And I literally drove to all 20 properties and stuck the yard sign in their front yard that said, "I got a permit." And that was incredibly meaningful to people, that they could say to their neighbors, "I'm making progress, I'm coming back." And that was really powerful as well. I think that's important. Communication is so critical. I can tell you, me and my team spent a lot of time going to neighborhood meetings and making sure that we were present and available at a scale that we had that was doable. For a handful of city staff to be regularly available in people's living rooms that had homes that survived where their neighbors didn't, and talk about the process, be very accessible. To this day, I talk to people that remember that time I showed up in their neighbor's home to help them figure out how to rebuild. So I think that kind of stuff is really critical. And we don't know everything. We're gonna learn as we go, and I think they have to know that we're human beings and that we're gonna make mistakes, but we're gonna remember that council guidance of what the goal was for the rebuild is really important. Like I said, keeping it human, we're all human, and making sure that we remember that this is hard for everybody. And then I think one of the last things I'll mention is the planning department will ultimately take the lead, planning and building, to make this recovery happen. But you can't do this without engineering and the fire department and public works. And one of the biggest debates we had is, is a grading permit required for the rebuild? And the question was, well, if they're building on the same pad that was there before and it's still certified, do they need a grading permit? And we had a debate for a while with Public Works. We ultimately said, unless they're removing and recompacting, or unless they're going more than 5 feet from the former property, the former foundation, a grading permit was not required. And I can tell you that's a big win for homeowners, that one less thing they have to do. And that was a big learning curve for us. We also had the fire department who had to review the landscaping plans in the new homes, and obviously with a heightened sensitivity to landscaping plans that are not the kind of fire resistant. And we had times where the fire department wanted to hold the issuance of building permit because they hadn't finished their review yet. And we had to sort of say, we're going to issue the building permit. The landscaping can catch up later. We can't delay the homeowner any further because of that. And that took some negotiation with fire, but we got there, I think. And we even had a whole process for, can you reuse your swimming pool? And there is a process of recertifying a swimming pool that might have survived the fire. And some survived, very few did, but some homeowners were like, if I can just save the swimming pool and not have to rebuild my pool. And we did have a process for that. And I think finally I'll say, one of the things that was really important is to help homeowners understand that when they rebuild, the more they can home harden the new home, the better. I mean, obviously the codes are going to require that more than when they built originally, but that they could do a little bit more. So educating them and what more they could do beyond the building code to harden their homes for future events. It might help their insurance. It'll help them feel safer. But it was hard for them to want to do more than the insurance would cover, because in most cases, the insurance didn't cover the full rebuild. And so doing more under those circumstances just seemed to be a burden. But we spent a lot of time educating homeowners on what home hardening techniques would be to help them build a stronger and better home when they were done. And I think, Mark, I'm going to leave it at that and open up the conversation.
Very good. So Jeff, let's talk a number of questions come in here, and I'm sure a lot of folks have a bunch of questions that they haven't written down yet, but there's some thematic things. And so the first piece of this is we're going to say, we're not going to fix it in this webcast today and address all of the various areas, but I think there's some great things to do. But I'm going to ask you to touch lightly on a few of these topics, and you already have. So on resiliency, some resiliency is pretty dramatic. It has to do with the materials of the structure. It has to do with the look and feel of the house from the outside pretty dramatically. Some resiliency is much more modest, what you plant around the outside of it, whether you have a wooden fence, whether you have vents that essentially are properly built to deal with embers, whether the glass in the structure is meant to deal with essentially hot embers and other things. Can you talk a little bit about it sounds like you didn't mandate much above standard state code, but you encouraged a bunch. What was the mix there between pushing people forward and nudging people forward?
Yeah, it was very clear that even in most cases, these homes were 20 to 30 years old. So the building code alone was going to be a significant change to their home from a resilient perspective. And so our position was that's a big enough improvement that if that's the baseline. We obviously had to get that. The building code had to comply with the current code, and that made a big difference. We beyond that, it was education and, like you said, nudging people along. We had some good architects that really understood materials and how to improve. We, like the fires we've had in Los Angeles, a lot of these homes were burned by flying embers going into the vents. And so that was the biggest aha moment. There's a couple that rebuilt their home, and it was an all wooden home with one of the few wood shake roofs. And they're now part of they've created a fire safe council in what was the burn area, and they go on the road and talk about with their neighbors what that means. And they've done a presentation on all the different things that changed in the rebuild to make their house more safe. Many of the things you just mentioned. So for us, it was building code's the most important. That's going to make a huge improvement. Beyond that, it's encouraging homeowners to do more, making the case that it could help their insurance if they did, and that in the long run would be better for them.
Okay. And if people are interested in hearing more about that particular topic, just sort of note that in the chat, and we'll do our very best to bring folks who are really knowledgeable about that area in for a future presentation. We'll talk about that. One of the other sets of questions that's popping up has to do with essentially businesses. So not only did a lot of homes burn in the LA collection of fires, a lot of businesses aren't there. And did you have to deal with essentially getting folks up into temporary corridors or other things to sort of preserve, especially things that weren't big chains or businesses that were on the smaller side, both to provide service to the residents there, but also to provide that continuity? In other words, if I don't live today, it's hard to be alive when people want me back,
Yeah.
2 years from now.
Yeah, we were lucky at the Thomas Fire that we didn't lose businesses. We lost homes and 2 apartment buildings. Although downtown Ventura, I mean, the fire came, if you know Ventura and the historic City Hall that's in downtown, the fire came right behind City Hall. And behind City Hall was the Botanical Gardens, which had just spent about 5 or 6 years creating this new Botanical Gardens, and it burned to the ground. It all burned, and it came right behind City Hall, but didn't hit the city and didn't hit downtown or Main Street. So we were lucky. I live 1 block on the other side of Main Street, so I was personally lucky. So that was helpful. I do think, though, that businesses suffered because the city was in just a haze of soot and air quality challenges for quite some time. I mean, we went back to City Hall about a week. It took us about a week to get back into City Hall, even though it wasn't physically damaged by fire. And I sat in my office with a huge air cleaner next to my desk. I couldn't hear myself think. But we had them all over City Hall to clean the air, and it was a really difficult time to work there. But we had to be open because the residents were coming in. But that was the biggest challenge for us. It was interesting. We had 2 apartment buildings that burned. One wanted to go right back and rebuild exactly what they had before. Building codes changed, so it was the heights were different and some of that, but we were able to get them under construction within a year, and they've been occupied now for several years. The second apartment is just now under construction because they came in and said, we're not going to build what we had before. We're going to start all over. So they didn't take advantage of any of the rebuild benefits. They started from scratch and wanted to build something completely different. And they're now just starting construction just a few weeks ago.
So the town that I grew up in, essentially Coalinga, was hit by a 6.7 magnitude earthquake in 1984. And I worked several summers doing rebuilding in the community. And one of the things, it wiped out the whole central business district. And so in that case, the council took steps, literally renting modular buildings and placing them on, getting permission from a property owner to place several of those modular buildings, sometimes holding 2 or 3 small businesses, to keep them alive during the multiple year rebuilding process. And that helped about half the businesses survive, which is, kind of dismal on the one hand, but probably exactly I don't think anybody would have survived without that. So taking into consideration what's within the city's power and what can you leverage at the state and federal level to help you with funding on some of that, is an important piece of the puzzle to keep businesses up and running, because people did want to utilize the businesses, whether it was the coffee shop or the clothing store or whatever small business it was. So that made a big difference, and also made it oddly a difference in morale, that we haven't given up on what looked like a whole area that just evaporated out of the center of the little town. That there was still some activity down there, that people were still trying to create a livelihood there.
Mark, I saw one of the questions about the debris removal and other sources, but so we, because the state had just had this experience in Santa Rosa, they used the State Office of Emergency Management took the lead, and they actually contracted with the company to do the removal, and they funded the difference between what the insurance paid for. And I have to go back and understand, I remember where that funding came from, but they were able to fund the difference through state and federal resources to pay that. And it was done very quickly. And I think we had 2 homeowners that decided to contract on their own with a local trash company. But they both realized at the end that they had to do it all over again with us because the trash company didn't certify the site that was buildable again. And so all they did is take trash away, but they didn't really do anything with the property to certify. So the process that we went through for 98% of the properties or more was much more efficient for those homeowners.
Had a question about LiDAR, and that's essentially light detection and ranging. Essentially, it is a system to get a very good mapping from 3D of what's actually out there in the real world. Maybe a question for future sessions. What lessons learned are there about contaminated tap water as a result of what's going on? And then, of course, a related one, we are going to talk a little bit about utilities, which sometimes are undersized, especially in historic neighborhoods, and the tension between bringing things up to be much better. It probably is a pretty good time to do that, and some of the delays that creates with those who are waiting on those utilities to be done.
Yeah, I mean, there were obviously Edison was in our hillsides putting systems back in place immediately after the fire, and we had similar problems with other places where the fire hydrants didn't have water, and homes were probably not the fires were not put out because the water ran out. I mean, literally, in order to have enough redundancy in the system to deal with these kind of disasters is almost impossible. We had issues where some of the water tanks did not have backup power, so the pump stopped working when the power went out. And so those have all been rectified with backup power for all the water tanks, and for future redundancy, that's helpful. But at the time, and there are lawsuits, and I left the city before those were resolved, so I can't tell you how they were resolved. Probably couldn't if I was there, but those kinds of things happen, and I'm sure they're going to happen in the Los Angeles area as well. I think one of the things we're working through in the city is how do we further underground more utilities? That's been a big challenge to get more utilities underground so that they're less susceptible to be part of the problem. Because some of the newer neighborhoods, they're all underground. That's just the way subdivisions are done. But the older hillside neighborhoods that are 100 years old or so, there's still a lot of above ground power that puts homes at risk.
Got it. Miguel, I noticed out in the field there, we've got Vivian Kahn, also a emeritus member of California Planning Roundtable, who was very involved in the East Bay fire recovery. Is there a way that we can unmute Vivian and there we go. You've got your hand up. Let me see. Can we get you to a place where
Ready to
unmute you? Vivian, can you unmute yourself? Yes, there we go.
Okay,
There we go. Hey, Vivian.
Hey, Vivian.
all right. I'm unmuted. I can't see myself, but that's okay, not necessary. So a few things. Berkeley lost 65 homes, which was substantially less than Oakland. Oakland had it was close to 3,000 units in Oakland. So the way we approached this was a little different in the two communities. Oakland established a rebuilding center in a vacant Safeway, and hired a new staff person to manage that. In Berkeley, I managed the rebuilding process. One of the first things that we did was set up meetings with the people from the burn area who were all concentrated in one part of the city. This was after the fire department had held a venting session. And I think that's something that is essential. I mean, we went through some absolutely draining meetings involving staff and people from the area who lost their homes. And I think as grueling as that was, it's essential for people to vent. And I think the fire chief was very patient, and a lot of that went toward the fire chief, but everybody ended up having to hear that. After that, one of the things that we did was we had a lot of meetings in the office with people from the burn area, and they set up a homeowners committee. So what I did was I presented our plans for how we were going to approach this to the homeowners committee. And at the point that we went to the council saying, this is what we propose to do, we had members of the homeowners committee sitting up in the front. They sat up there with me and they told the council, we support these proposals from staff. Berkeley, as everybody, has had a very, very strict regulatory process. And the ordinance that I drafted with the city attorney essentially took all of the power away from the zoning adjustments board, which was the administrative body that acted on applications for all kinds of zoning approvals, and gave it to staff. Similar to the situation that Jeff had, I was able to sign off on just about everything. And I had one situation where there was an initial appeal to council and then that was dropped. One of the differences between Berkeley and Ventura, and I think it's going to be a problem in several of the areas that were destroyed in the LA area, was that many of these homes were built not 20 to 30 years ago, but 60 and 70 years ago. We had another problem in that the entire area in Berkeley and large portions of the burn areas in Oakland were underlain by fault lines. So when we went out to determine how we should handle the rebuilding, we had to deal with Alquist Priolo, which didn't exist prior to all of this. We got an agreement from the state that rather than doing individual geologic analyses, we could do one big, thorough analysis for the entire fire area, which would identify properties that had really severe problems, like one that was built right on top of the fault line. They wouldn't have to do individual studies. So that's something, and FEMA agreed to pay for that. So that was great. But another problem we found was that when people came in, they didn't know where their property lines were. Because when you're in a seismically active area, the monuments move. And to this day, there are surveyors who will not sign off on a property survey in areas of the East Bay Hills because nobody knows where the monuments are supposed to be. So what the city decided to do was we said, okay, we will go and survey the center line of the roads that go through the area. You can go and take your bearings off that line. I mean, you know approximately how wide your lot is. So just go and figure out what the property lines are, and everybody ended up agreeing on that. We had as I recall, we didn't have any problems with property lines, even though nobody to this day knows where the property lines originally were. So that's
Wow, those are great tips, Vivian, and a whole string of them. And I think that is really helpful. Sort of thematic elements. The streamlining is really think holistically about what set of powers can be delegated down to the staff level to get stuff done, because the council is going to be motivated to look for real things that make a real difference. And, staff has to be, careful what you ask for then, because it will be your fault. But at the same time, you're probably in the best position, at the senior staff level to make those tough calls. Certainly, if we're going to have it done in this decade, for most of this rebuild.
Mark, I
Yeah,
just
and
put
we
into the
did,
chat.
we did have funding to hire outside staff. So we hired Wildan assisted us with plan check. And then I hired a planner who handled all of the negotiations with the neighbors and brought people together when it appeared there were issues. Uh, as I said in an email initially to Miguel, make sure you document of your costs. Keep very careful timesheets so you can get reimbursed from FEMA if FEMA is still doing that in the future, and who knows. But I mean, after I left the city, we determined that we were missing a bunch of invoices and timesheets. And I remembered that there was one more box of timesheets that for some reason or other didn't show up, and we found it stashed under a stairway in the permit center. But make sure that you keep those records, because when you go to FEMA for reimbursement, they're going to want to see all of the timesheets and invoices and everything. And there's no way you're going to be able to report this on your own.
Yep.
Mark, I just
Keeping
dropped in the
record.
debris removal link into the chat too. So
Very good.
Cali and the California Recycling did all that work.
One of the other things that we have figured out in the fires is the front edge of the burning is usually 2 to sometimes as far as 3 miles in front of the main flame. So of course, many of us were taught in school about defensible space, and fire breaks and fire buffers, that were hundreds of yards across, or maybe a quarter mile across, or maybe a half mile across, as or a freeway as being an impassable area. The fire would never leap a freeway. And of course, what we found over and over again is that the fire basically jumps hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feet, but oftentimes much more than a mile or two in heavy winds, sort of, putting defensible space sort of on its head. Defensible space works perfectly in a neighborhood fire where there's one house on fire and you don't want the house next door on fire. It's an amazing tool. But in wildland interface, and in fact, non-wildland interface, essentially once a fire is going and it's reached a certain critical mass, those strategies don't work very effectively. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that in the future. In the case of Ventura, did you change utilities as you rebuilt? Did you put utilities underground if they were overhead, or did they just rebuild them as they were?
We did both. Where it was easy to do underground, we did. Otherwise, we rebuilt them above ground and repaired them where they were. The city is actually right now looking at a complete citywide underground utility program, property assessment program to do that. But we're not there yet.
Yeah. We had a little folks chiming in, noting that the 10% also worked in coastal rebuild areas. So that generally streamlined that process as well. Obviously we have questions about what role FEMA will play in this going forward under the current administration. Figuring that out is going to be part of the fun of going through this particular session as well. Jeff, anything that you wanted to leave the group with before I bring it back to Miguel and we wrap up for this time? We'll talk a little bit about what's coming on next.
I don't think so. Otherwise, I'm just putting into the chat the city council sort of rebuild statement, just because it's pretty mom and apple pie, but it was important for us to, we have council that are not always agreeing. So the council had to have one voice through this process. And just as an aside, the night the fire hit was the night we were doing the changing of the guard of the mayor and deputy mayor. And literally the new mayor was giving his speech having just been sworn in as mayor when the entire executive team left the council chambers to go to the EOC. So it was a very interesting time for us. But having the council be really clear and consistent and have consensus across the council, all 7 of them, regardless of their perspective, that they all agreed on our approach to go forward was really important. And we had Thomas Fire on the agenda, as you can imagine, every council meeting for at least a year, to make sure that they stay sort of in alignment. And we if there was any issue, we could address it quickly because the community needed us to have one voice. And that was really critical to us. I would also say, and I've said this to the folks in LA too, much bigger group, but having the same few people that are always the voice to the community, so the community can build trust with their government, and they don't have to meet somebody new every time there's a community meeting is really critical. It's tough when you're going to a lot of meetings, but the community really needs to see government as a partner in their recovery.
And don't underestimate the ability, if you have a declared local emergency, to use all of those powers that accrue with essentially your chief operating officer, usually it's your city manager, the ability to do things instantaneously that normally would take weeks or months, and then have the council ratify that after the fact. You know, whenever I had to do that as a city manager, I wanted to check in a little bit to see at least I had 1 or 2 council members heading the same direction as I was going. But there was a lot of alignment. If I was clear about their vision, I was almost always in very good shape at doing one of those declarations. And the help that can provide in the short run is cumulatively, you know, helps over time. We've had a lot of questions about utilities, about hardening, about planning, about would we do things a little differently in some of the rebuild, or there's very specific areas in your communities that you do need to maybe think about circulation and other things. Great topics for future sessions, because I do think it is, while we can't redesign a community from the ground up at this particular point, at least folks have not thought that that's the right balance between rebuilding and improving. Some strategic improvements might make sense, and figuring out how to go through that process and how others have done that might be a great topic for a future webcast here. And Miguel, we've been tracking the questions in the chat, correct? We haven't been able to get to all of those today, but one of the things we can do is take a look at those after the fact and maybe build a few new webinars off of that. Does that sound like a way forward? And do you want to wrap us up at this point? We did promise that we would try and get people through this webinar in about an hour. And I think we've talked about a few things, but clearly we've got a lot more work to do as we move forward here. And we do want to be clear that this is the first of several of these that we want to do, and several that we want to be useful for folks who are listening in.
Yes, thank you so much, Mark, Jeff. On behalf of everybody, I'll just applaud, because you can't see the other attendees, but I'm certain that they're very grateful for what you shared today. This was an amazing conversation. I think the content that you both shared is extremely important for our planners and anyone else interested in rebuilding the communities that are affected by these wildfires. As a way to wrap this up, we added a link to a Google form. If you didn't have an opportunity to make a comment or ask a question, you can use that form. In addition, you can include a resource if there's anything for us that you want us to acknowledge. We are in the process of working on a clearinghouse of resources, and I saw James Castañeda there adding actually a question related to that. So hopefully he can engage with us to build it. After this meeting, our working group is going to debrief on this conversation so that we can plan for the next webinar. We're hoping to make them as regular as possible. At this point, we're looking at every Friday at 1 p.m. The announcement will be provided very soon via APA California in social media. So we will be making that determination. I want to also let you know that there's in the chat a link to the webpage where you can find the recording for the webinar and any other information that we will be distributing after the session concludes in moving forward. And I'd like to acknowledge the great work that the Compass team, which is part of APA California, Chrissy, Cher, and Brian, thank you so much for all your support. And Desmond is the chapter's communications officer. Actually, if you could share his email address in the chat, that would be great, but we will include that also in our report to you, so you can have that information if you want to reach out to the chapter directly. But perhaps, Carrie, would you like to bring us to close if you are available?
You should have warned Carrie that she was going to do that. You may find
We're building the plane as we fly, right?
So
I'm back.
very good.
She's
Yay.
back.
Yes. You know, it's a bummer to hear your name called when someone stepped into your office for just a quick second. So
Yeah, no, I thank you guys, everyone. This has really been amazing. I think that it's the beginning of the conversation, and not the end. And I'm glad this is all recorded. There's a lot of good stuff in the chat, you know, Q&A and chat. So a lot of good resources. So just
Carrie,
thank you for.
remind us where we can find that, because we've had a couple people ask. So we're going to be on the APA website, aren't we? And we've got
Yes.
a little slot there. And in fact,
Yes.
Miguel, you had a slide that had the actual address in there. Did you not? Do you want to go ahead and share that as we leave?
And I did put it in the chat also, the
Oh, good.
apacalifornia.org/LA fires.
So this recording, as well as other super useful resources. So Carrie, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, that's pretty much it. Just you know, continue to check the website, because I think that's where we're going to really try to make it as active as possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you all for being with us today. We look forward to coming back in future weeks, and we'll have, as you've figured out, there are a lot of challenges between here and being rebuilt. So we'll be here for a bit, trying to get as much of those resources into your hands as possible. So thank you all for spending a part of your afternoon with us. And thank you for the work you're doing in the middle of this devastation. It is super important, and take care of yourselves and the others who are also providing services there. And if there's anything that we at the California Planning Roundtable or California APA can do to make your job a little bit easier, please let us know. So thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
Bye,
Bye,
thanks.
everybody.